Hey everybody, Ron Bielefeld, Whistling Wings Photography. This video is about Canon's Zone, more specifically their Flexible Zone Autofocus system. And so, because you can't really depend on a bird coming whenever you want to, I put in the woods over here a little bit, I put one of my carved birds for demonstration purposes. But we're going to talk about, this video is really for everybody. For people that haven't used Canon's Zone Flexible Zone Autofocus system before, to those who have, maybe I can provide some things to think about that you haven't thought about before, because I use it almost exclusively. And I use it with my 3 back button autofocus setup. Got a video on that. Got a couple of them actually out there. Put a link in the description down below, and maybe a link up in the frame here somewhere about setting up 3 different back buttons for 3 different autofocus methods or areas or whatever you want to call them, and why that's really important. But today we're talking about the autofocus, and we're specifically talking about the flexible zones. And if you shoot a Canon R5, the original R5, you have zones. You have zone autofocus, and I'm sure you've probably used it, but they're not flexible. You can't change the size of them, and that's what the flexible means. Now, why is that important? Well, we're going to talk about that. And this may kind of get you to a point of saying, you know what, I might want to upgrade to one of the cameras like the R5 Mark II or the R1 or the R3 that has the flexible zones versus just the zones that are pre-sized for me because of the way zones work. And we'll get to that as well. So let's start out talking about what is a zone. Well, if we look through the viewfinder of the camera, you can see that there's some white brackets in there, and those are the brackets that are defining the zone for the autofocus system. It's the area that the autofocus is going to look for your subject. In this case, I have my subject set to birds, well, animals for Canon, which includes birds. And it's going to look only in there. It's going to exclude everything else that's in the full frame. Well, why is that a good thing? I think you can probably figure out right away why that's good. If, again, we look through the viewfinder, and there's a bird out there. There's a western tanager. Guess what? I'm in Florida, but anyway, it's a good bird for this. You can see that the background is really, really noisy, cluttered. If you do the full frame, now the autofocus has to look throughout the entire frame for your subject amongst a bunch of clutter, and it may have a harder time finding the bird than if you restrict where it has to look down to a smaller zone. Now, I have it set to zone 1. There's 3 presets, zones, flexible zones that you can set. And I'll show you in a minute how I set those up. But for this example, we're getting at why use a zone. Well, this is it. You're restricting where the autofocus has to look for your subject, taking away a bunch of stuff that may distract it from the actual subject. And if we go in here and I hit focus, boom, it goes right to the eye of that bird, which was out of focus. But again, it's only looking within those white brackets for the subject. There's clutter there too, but the bird's in there and it's filling up quite a big bit of that zone. And so it's pretty easy then for the autofocus to find your subject rather than it having to look throughout the frame and all of that clutter. That's when I use zone. I use zone 90+% of the time, a zone. Not the same zone, not the same size zone. So let's talk a little bit about the flexibility of these zones in the newer Canon cameras, why that's important. Okay, so here we go. So now, well, you know what? I'm going to show you, I'm going to backtrack just a second. I'm going to show you a video, which is a series of over 200 images of a barred owl flying, coming right at me, maybe coming across. Might even put 2 series in here for you to see. You can see that the bird is transitioning. It's not blue sky background, okay? It's cluttered. And then a couple of these series, it's really cluttered. The autofocus never missed. It stayed on the entire time. Every one of the images you see in these series are sharp on the bird, and a big help there was that I had it set to a zone and not full frame. Again, we're going to talk about switching over using the 3 back buttons that I use for my autofocus system. I have one back button set up for one like zone, and then I have full frame with eye detection, then I have the one on the right set to spot. There's a reason for all of this, and we'll talk about it again in the realm of how these zones actually work. But let's get into the menu system here, and I'll show you the flexibility of these zones. So if we go in here now, and I go in, you can see that down below on the right there, there's a 1 in a bracket, a 2 in a bracket, and a 3 in a bracket. Those are your 3 flexible zones that you can set up. And the way I have it set up is zone 1 looks like this, that size right there. Zone 2 looks like that, a little bit bigger. And then zone 3 looks like that, much bigger, but not the full frame, because I have the full frame. Here. Now, to activate this, I have it set up on my autofocus on button. But if I go over to my asterisk button, another back button on the back of Canon bodies, you can see it goes to full frame eye detection. That's a separate setup. That is not a zone. That's full frame looking for the eye. All right? So again, back to the zones. Now, you can change the size of these zones to be whatever you want. I have it set up on my multifunction button up front, and you can see I hit the set button. Now I can use the wheels, the main dial, to set, timed out on me. I can use the main dial to set the width of the zone, and I can use the thumb wheel to set the height of the zone. This is where the flexible zones come into play. You can make them flexible. They're flexible for size. Now, why is that important? Well, it's because of how the zones work, especially when you have an algorithm chosen by picking animals and eye detection being enabled, let's say. If we go into my menu system, you can see that my autofocus is set up for area 3, that's zone, flexible zone 3, and then whole area tracking servo autofocus is turned off. And this is really important because if you turn it up, let's just go ahead, let's turn that on. And now watch how this works. I'm going to actually put this over to zone 1, the smallest zone. So now it looks the same as it was before, but remember I had whole area tracking turned off. So now if I turn it on, watch what happens when I hit my autofocus on button and it finds the bird. Boom. It goes to the bird and it focuses, but it automatically switches to full frame. That is not the kind of zone behavior I want. So what I do is I make sure that in here, whole area servo autofocus tracking stuff is turned off. And now when we go back in here and I hit the autofocus on button and hold it, it focuses on the bird's eye, but only within the zone. If I move this around, it only focuses within the zone. It doesn't switch to full frame. I don't want it to switch to full frame. I want what I call a pure zone setup. That's what this is. So now, why are sizes so important? Because when you have animals selected or people selected or vehicles selected, you're selecting to run an algorithm, and then you're adding on to that algorithm by, let's say, having eye detection turned on, which I do and don't sometimes in my zones. Right now I do. And the thing about algorithms that are so different from what we had before with digital SLRs, where it was just autofocus points, and what the autofocus points were on is where it focused. That's not the way these mirrorless tracking autofocus systems work. They work by looking for something that you define by picking animals and eye detection, for example. It's going to look for a bird or an animal, and it's going to look not only for that, it's going to look for an eye. It's running an algorithm. What are algorithms? Let's just make it simple. They train the algorithm, they put 1 million pictures through this thing of all the different birds and animals and everything, and eyes and what the silhouette of a bird looks like, and all that kind of stuff. And then when you hit the autofocus button for it to look for a bird in this case, it's looking to match it to something it's seen before. And that works great when the bird, like in here, is relatively small in the frame. It's pretty big, but it's relatively small in the frame, and the whole bird fits inside the zone. That algorithm can easily identify that as something it's seen before, a bird. Now what happens, however, if that bird flies at you? Not a little bird like this, but how about the owl scenario, where it was flying right at me, and it got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And if you had a small zone picked, and all of a sudden it starts filling the zone completely with just feathers, let's say. No beak, no eyes, no head silhouette shapes, no wings beating that it can see. Guess what? It's not going to do very well focusing on that and keeping focus on that, because the algorithm wasn't trained to look for just feathers or some small part of the bird necessarily. That's why it's important to have different size zones so that you can keep the zone big enough so that something that the algorithm knows and is looking for is identifiable within that zone. So that's why the different zone sizes for different scenarios that I'm shooting based on the size of the bird in the frame. Now you say, okay, well, now that bird's coming right at you. You don't have time to change your zone up. Well, I could have my autofocus on button on zone 1, the smaller one, and I could have the asterisk button over there to a bigger zone and stuff. But what did I just show you? I showed you that my asterisk button is actually set to jump to full frame eye detection. So what I'm doing is that owl's flying right at me. Is I'm originally starting with my zone, and once it starts getting too big in the frame, I just move my thumb over, keep shooting, and it jumps to full frame eye detection, and it does really well staying on the bird because it's looking at the whole frame now, and there's something in that frame that is something it was trained to find and see and identify as a bird, an animal, and stay focused on it. This is something that is so unbelievably good. This is why I use 3 back buttons. This is why I use flexible zones. This is how they work. And this is what you need to do to maximize getting sharp images. Every one of the owl shots that you see coming at me from way over there until it's so freaking big in the frame is tack sharp. In the past, digital SLRs using just autofocus points, man, it had a hard time when things got close, couldn't keep up. With zones, when they were small on the R5 and it's filling that thing up, it didn't do well. Now you have the flexibility with zones getting bigger, bigger, smaller, smaller, to exclude things in the background, to find your bird initially, but to grow if you need to keep that algorithm finding something that it needs to allow it to keep accurate focus on things, your birds, and then even going to full frame just by moving your thumb, which you can easily do in a split second while you're actually shooting. Unbelievable. It hardly ever misses if you set it up like this and you understand how these algorithms and these zones are working. You'll miss very few shots, very few now. So, that's the deal. That's the deal right there. And so I'm looking through here right now, and there's a zone there. I go to my asterisk button, there's the full frame eye detection. And then if I go all the way over, it goes to spot, which I like to have available because sometimes if you're using a zone, even a small zone, in a scenario like this with cluttered backgrounds, it doesn't find the bird right away, but you see it. Put the spot on the bird, get initial focus, and then go to zone. You've already just told the autofocus what your subject is by using spot. It's going to find it this time. Almost 90+% of the time it'll find it with zone, and then it'll track it within the zone. So, what else do we need to talk about here? I don't know, but try zone autofocus. Try the flexible zone system and set it up to where you can make the most of it with back buttons so you can instantly change the size of your zone to fit your shooting scenario, or set it up on buttons so you can easily go from zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, them being different sizes. However you want to set it up. But you gotta try, please do yourself a favor and use zone autofocus to your advantage. I think that's it. Hey, those of you who want to do tours, and you want to photograph some belted kingfishers, just email me, text me, and we will, just email me. Email me, it's best. You can go to my website, www.whistlingwingsphotography.com, or you can just go Ron at whistlingwingsphotography.com. You can just email me, and we can set up a tour for belted kingfishers because, man, it's happening now all the way through the end of February. What else? Oh, I do make a harness system too, and you probably saw a video in here somewhere advertising my speed shooter harness system. It's a great solution for certain types of shooting, especially for those of you who want to use heavier equipment and not get really tired, but even for smaller combos, it's still great. So I'm going to leave it there. With this, I hope you're getting great images. We're getting some pretty good light here in Florida now. We had a couple weeks where it was really not very nice. Hey, be safe out there. I'll see you soon.